Hey out there, Ground Zero Comics community. Okay, we gotta ask, how are you guys doing? Is everybody hanging in there okay? It's only been one day, but of course on the upside, hey, we've made it through one day, or even longer depending on when you're watching this video. Now, I said I was gonna be here, so here I am. Store's kind of dark, the doors are locked, but I'm here with you guys because whatever you're doing, you're not doing it alone. Now, I hope you're using this time to catch up on that stack of comics you've been intending to read, to tackle those projects that have been waiting for you. Whatever you're doing, again, we're in this together. So if you're reading something you're really liking, put it in our comments. Keep in touch. We're all part of the same community here. Now, that being said, I said in my last video that I would be here and I would talk about comics history or any subjects you wanted me to talk about. So put them in the comments, and sure enough, we had one. Luckily, and Mr. Joshua Smith writes into us, "Hey Dave, I would love to hear some background of the character the Sandman, not Neil Gaiman's endless character, but the Golden Age superhero who inspired him." Josh, thank you so much. You actually really bailed us out because the Sandman is a good one. I can do this, and we're gonna tackle it in a segment we're now gonna call, thanks to Carl Fulmer, Interestingly Enough. Now, the Sandman goes back to the earliest days of superheroes, 1939 in fact. Superman had only premiered 1 year earlier. Superman premiered in the summer of 1938. Sandman comes along in the summer of 1939. Now, he was created, at least it's believed to be created, by Gardner Fox and Burt Christman. Now, Gardner Fox is a legend in the industry. He created so many stories, so many characters, had an incredibly illustrious career. However, how much he actually had to do with the Sandman is pretty debatable. They didn't do proper crediting back then. At the very least, they know he wrote the first couple of stories. Burt Christman, on the other hand, we do know had a lot to do with the creation of this character. He not only drew the first 10 stories, he also wrote some of them. He designed the character, he designed the costume, came up with the gadgets. Basically, if you're going to have a single father of this character, he's the guy. Now, he drew a lot from the pulp characters that were the direct antecedents of comic books in those days. Because, again, this is 1939. There were no established rules yet. The character was supposed to premiere in Adventure Comics number 40 in July of 1939. Although what actually wound up happening was an issue that was supposed to appear after it, New York World's Fair Comics number 1, actually wound up hitting the stands 2 weeks earlier. So the Adventure Comics issue was drawn first and intended to be published first. The New York World's Fair actually hit the stands and was bought first. Take your pick. It could be either one. The character himself is going to sound a little bit on the familiar side. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Wesley Dodds, a millionaire philanthropic playboy who's also a genius inventor and socially conscious enough that he's going to fight crime on the side, decides to don a business suit, a purple cape, a fedora, and a gas mask. It was 1939. There were no rules. Why not? And basically prowl the night as the Avenger of Justice, the Sandman. Now, he didn't have any superpowers. What he did have was a gun that was gassy. It shot sleeping gas because somewhere along the way, somebody at DC decided, heck yeah, this is a great concept. Let's have a superhero that puts their villains to sleep. Not only that, his calling card for the cops and for everybody to know that he was the one who had brought these nefarious foes to justice was he would sprinkle sand on them. Let's face it, in today's world, he would come so close to being called Dirt Man because they would find the characters and, hey, he's got dirt on him, must be that new superhero. Dirt Man it is. But that's what they had. And the stories were fairly stock pulp adventures. He would rescue some heiress. He would take on a couple of mob bosses, penny ante stuff, kidnappers, things like that. The evil, nefarious narcotics industry. Nothing like what we know today. And frankly, not like what we very quickly started getting with the better characters of the day. But what elevated those early issues was the art of Burt Christman. He came directly from the Milk kind of school genre of drawing and managed to make even fairly mundane situations and stories look pretty visually arresting. He did a terrific job on this book. Sadly, he only did 10 stories because he never wanted to be a comic book artist. He wanted to be a pilot. So he quit the comic book industry, joined the Navy, became a pilot, ultimately ending up in the really famous Flying Tigers. Sadly, he was shot down over Burma, actually apparently gunned down by the Japanese as he was parachuting to the ground. Ended his life at basically 26. Once he was gone, a couple of other people took over the book. First was Craig Flessel, and he did solid work. Nothing spectacular, but nothing bad either. And he was followed by Paul Norris. Paul Norris is best known, if he's known really at all, for an incredibly long run of Aquaman stories. He drew so many Aquaman stories, you can pretty much almost default to, if you don't recognize another artist on it, it's probably Paul Norris. However, his work on Sandman was really uninspired. Even he himself said this at conventions, in interviews. It wasn't really where his heart was. So he will probably forever be known as the Aquaman artist, not Sandman. Because of all this, the character was headed for obscurity and headed there fast. Luckily, help was on the way in the form of DC's crosstown competitors. Because you see, Timely Comics was began by Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman was a shifty, crooked character in an industry of shifty, crooked characters. He was notorious for not paying his artist, for taking stories from other magazines and changing the names of the characters and then publishing them as original work in his own books. You name it, he did it. Anything for a quick buck. And he saw superheroes were a hot trend, and so he jumped on it with a vengeance. And he'd already published Marvel Mystery Comics and a couple of titles, and decided to go to one of his crosstown competitors, an equally shifty, crooked man by the name of Victor Fox, and hire away his two best creators, which in this case was Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Now, Simon and Kirby came over to Timely, started working on a number of characters, but their best concept and the first one out of the gate was originally going to be called Super American. Then somebody realized Super American's going to be awfully close to Superman. We're going to get sued. So at the last minute, they changed the title to Captain America. Now, Captain America was a runaway hit, selling 1 million copies an issue right out of the box. And the deal that Kirby and Simon had for the book was 25% of the profits, just the actual profits from the book. Now, about this time, a gangly young man by the name of Stanley Lieber came into Timely offices because his cousin was married to Martin Goodman. So he needed work, had pretty much failed at trying to break into the writing business, and Goodman took him to Simon and Kirby and said, give him something to do. We're related. So he was emptying ashtrays, he was filling ink pots, he was going and getting coffee. Now, of course, needless to say, Stanley Lieber, we know today as Stan Lee. His primary job really seemed to be mostly to annoy Simon and Kirby. But of course, because the book was such a success and their deal was for a percentage of the profits, they were getting rooked. An accountant took Joe Simon aside at one of the meetings and said, just so you know what's happening, what Goodman is doing is taking all of the other books and taking their expenses and putting them onto the expenses of Captain America, which takes away all of the profits. So we had this book that's selling 1 million copies and you're getting next to nothing for it. So of course, Kirby and Simon were going to take their talents elsewhere. They contacted Jack Leibowitz over at DC, who said, absolutely, come here and work for us. We'll treat you right. Meanwhile, Stan Lee was kind of following around saying, guys, what's going on? You got some extra work? What you going to do? What's happening here? And okay, they finally let him in on it and said, you got spunk, kid. You're annoying, but you got spunk. We'll take you with us. Don't tell anybody. Almost immediately, Martin Goodman found out. And not only did he find out, he kicked them out of the offices physically that day. Had them forcibly removed from Timely offices and said, never darken our doors again. Stan Lee swore he wasn't the one that ratted him out. Kirby wasn't buying it for an instant. So Kirby said, you're not going with us. Deal's off, kid. Worked out okay for Stan Lee because he then became the editor of the Captain America comic book, and then one by one became pretty much the editor of the entire line, and 20 years later, launched the whole Marvel Universe revolution. It worked out okay for Stan Lee. Now, for Simon and Kirby, they went over to DC and took over a character that frankly was failing. By this point, they had lost the fedora, lost the cape, lost the business suit, because those seemed really antiquated in the late 1930s, early 1940s. You gotta remember, superheroes were new. Colorful spandex costumes seemed fresh and exciting. And so this is what he was by that point. That's right, people. Purple and yellow, a stylish combination. But it's what we had, it's what they worked with. When Kirby got there, Kirby was known for dynamic art. Characters did not speak, they exclaimed. They did not walk into a room, they burst into the room. Everything he did was over the top, bigger than life. And that's what he brought to Sandman. Sandman still had his gun, still had his gas gun, but he forgot it was there. He never pulled it out of his holster. He did what everybody wanted Sandman to do in the first place. He punched people. He punched them a lot. And occasionally he'd kick them or jump on them. But it was a physical, dynamic, exciting book under Jack Kirby. And all of a sudden, the failing Sandman story was a success. And you could tell it was a success because it was moving from the back of the book to the front of the book. Comics back then were like record albums in the 70s and 80s. With albums, you always put the hit single at the start because that's what the radio stations are going to play first. They're not going to listen to all 10 songs to know what they want to play. They're going to listen to the first song or two. So you put your best song right at the beginning. That's what they did with comic books. So, Detective Comics, hey, first page, Batman. Steve Malone, District Attorney, that goes in the back. That's just the way the industry worked. So Sandman moved from the back of Adventure Comics all the way up to the front of Adventure Comics and was on the cover just about every month. He was a hit. Now, the war was going on, so Simon and Kirby both knew their days were numbered before they were going to get called into service. Now, Kirby was known as an incredibly fast artist, so he was working night and day to churn out as much work as he could so that when they did get called into service, he would still have published work to feed his family. So they got quite a bit ahead, and sure enough got called into service. When they got through with their tenure in the armed forces, they came back to the States, healthy and sound, but they did not return to DC because instead they went to another publisher and started another entire whole genre of comics. But that's another story. At this point, with the end of the Kirby and Simon run, Sandman was a character that largely stopped being published and was forgotten. He came back in anytime they would have a Justice Society of America, Justice League crossover, and you started seeing some Earth 2 appearances and things like that, but he basically was a fairly forgotten minor character. This was until really the 70s. In the 1970s, there was a very short-lived book also called The Sandman. Now, this once again brought back some of the last ever work from Jack Kirby and Joe Simon together. And that was this book. Now, this book was not the same character at all. This Sandman was in the dream world. His job was to monitor nightmares and make sure they weren't getting out of hand. If you were a young person and getting plagued by too many nightmares, this was the guy you wanted to call. He had a gun, he had a cowl, he had a mask. Why you need a mask if you're in the dream world? No idea. But being Kirby, it was dynamic, it's kitschy, it was over the top, it was a lot of fun. That was the series that Neil Gaiman was going to revive for DC. Oddly enough, not the Golden Age character. Gaiman had proposed this to DC, and DC had kind of been dragging their feet. They weren't terribly interested, weren't necessarily going to do it. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. And he moved on and did some other work. Then apparently he's at a convention and Karen Berger says to him, "Hey, you still interested in the Sandman character?" Gaiman says, "Yeah, sure. What's the catch?" The catch is, you can't use that character because they're using him now in Infinity Inc. We want you to create a completely new character, which is what he did. He basically went with all the same concepts, just made it more classical, turned obviously the character of Sandman into Morpheus and his brethren, the Endless, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, today, of course, we know Sandman as one of the masterworks of modern comics, but that's the odd progression that actually got us there. Now, once Sandman was out and was so popular, another series came out by Matt Wagner called Sandman Mystery Theater, which brought back the fedora and the business suit and the cape and all that sort of stuff, and is an excellent, excellent comic. Unfortunately, they're cheap, which means they're really kind of difficult to find, but hunt all the local comic shops you can, go through their bargain bins. If you see copies of Sandman Mystery Theater, snatch them up. They're also a lot of fun. That's really about the extent of the history of the character of Sandman. Now, most of this stuff is pretty available. The Golden Age Sandman actually is collected in a DC Archives book. It's expensive, but it's got all of the Burt Christman run and some of the Craig Flessel run. Sadly, this next one is out of print. This collects all of the Joe Simon and Jack Kirby issues. Really good, though, and they published a lot of them, so they're probably found aftermarket fairly easily. Most of that stuff's out there, so all you have to do is go look for it. It's a really fascinating character and a progression from something that was not even remotely similar to what we know as Sandman today, but you follow the progression and you get to what is now one of the touchstones of modern comics. There we are. That's the history of the Golden Age Sandman as I know it. If you got anybody else you want to know about it, doesn't have to be a character. If you want to know why Marvel characters didn't fly under their own power, or how the Comics Code got to be, please let me know. That's what I do here. And that's what I'm going to do for you guys during these 2 weeks while we're all supposed to be stuck at home. Guys, take care of yourself. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.